Thank you, Ben. Good morning, church. Good morning. It is an absolute joy being together. Amen. Every time, virtually every time, I preach a lesson, there's something that was the springboard, something that was the spark, something happened that kept me thinking about that particular thing, and this morning's lesson is no different. This morning, I'd like us to talk about the power of influence. Because what happens almost universally, we see, well, yeah, we do our little part, or but that hardly makes a difference to everybody else. We don't begin to appreciate the impact it does have. Because we just think, oh, I'm a little pebble thrown in the water, one ripple, we're done. Not so at all. What happened is, this year, 2 different times, once I was at a memorial for some of you knew Warden Kay's Ellsworth and seniors, and he passed away maybe 5 years ago, and she more toward the spring. And at the memorial that somebody else was doing, Glenn and I were sitting kind of in the back, and there's chairs, and we're to the left 2 of 4. And an older couple came and looking for a place to sit, and they kind of looked at me like people do, are these available? And I just patted them, I say, sure. And come sit down. And I generally just make a comment or two, hey, we got plenty of room here. And she says, what's your name? And I was about to tell her, she said, don't tell me. I go, okay. And she said, did you preach sometime in Mount Vernon? Church, that was 50 years ago. Like 1 or 2 times, just a guest speaker. And she said, your name's Paul Hawthorne. I said, yeah, how did you know that? She said, I was a teenager. I was looking forward to getting married, and you spoke on what makes a happy family. You remember my voice from 50 years ago? Blew me away. Then, this last week, Glenn and I are having lunch with a woman who wanted to ask some Bible questions. Now, this woman I had baptized when she was a teenager. She got married, and life happens, and kind of got off track for a while, and she's looking to get the pieces back together. And she says, Paul, when we were in Sumner, in your sermon, she said, I remember you saying, I remember where I was sitting in the congregation when you said, and she said, you said, no democracy lasts more than about 200 years. And I said, that's true. She said, how long will we last? I said, well, that I don't know. A teenager remembers something 50 years? Blew me away. Because you think, well, I'm just sharing, here's some good thoughts, and it's, good, and then on to the next something or other. And so I'd like us to talk about the power of influence. The idea of power is just the capacity to impact something, to affect changes in people, events, attitudes, behavior, something. And so Christians do not see themselves as having the degree of power of influence that they have. They think, I'm just this little peanut. Influence is, from a personal standpoint, when you impact the things around you, not by force, but by your example. You're just living your life. But it's your words, your wisdom, your choices, for good or bad, that makes the impact on others. So I'm just doing this, is what I always do. That's right, and that's what makes the difference. There's no question that your words, your actions, and your example influence others. The question is not if, but how and how much. As I mentioned in the introductory announcements, Tom and Anna Burrell are with us, and what I'm about to say has been replicated, demonstrated by other members in this congregation. But here was Anna. She had Guillain-Barré syndrome that paralyzed down. Lips down on my way of explaining it. But her attitude was spectacular. Okay, I'm doing a little bit better. And things would go on. Well, she could move her hands, but it wasn't with the dexterity. And little by little, and then to a brace on her leg and a walker and walking. And nobody goes through tough stuff. I didn't ask her this, but every day can't be, yay, right? Everybody's life is up and down. But we saw that same kind of attitude in Joe and Karen Bartle, in Jim Myers. Over and over again, people face these humongous things, and they say, I'm in there for the fight. Maybe not those words, but the attitude is, look, I'm standing on the promises of God. When we think about that aspect of influence, we see it in our own solar system. This particular statement was new to me, that the sun is said to be 99.8% of the mass of our entire solar system. You got Earth and Mars and Venus and Mercury and Jupiter and Neptune and all. Oh yeah, man, that is just this little tiny bit. I never visualized how massive the sun is in regard to everything else. This is by National Geographic, July 2023. The sun drives our weather, our ocean currents, the seasons and climate, and without its light and heat, life on Earth could not exist. Well, that's an influence. It's just because we happen to be nearby, that's what happens to us. And so I thought about it this way. Why are we as an Earth where we are? Well, because the sun's gravitational attraction. It keeps us from floating off into the universe and freezing to death. It is said that absolute zero is 272 or 273 degrees below zero. It is said if we didn't have the sun's heat, Earth would eventually get to 400 degrees below zero. It's the influence of the sun. And I thought about it this way. The sun doesn't try to do this. I'm going to try to make that happen. It just does what it does by being present and doing what's natural for it. And that's what you do. You don't see how big your influence is in helping and impacting others. In fact, Earth as well affects the moon's orbit. The moon affects the Earth's tides. Everything has an impact to some degree. This morning's lesson is, so do you. But people often feel like they have little influence, but the reality is that's wrong. It is a major influence. We just never expect it. Yeah, but Paul, see, and depending on who you are, and not all of these is going to apply to everybody. You'll say, yeah, I'm in this category, but no, I'm not in that category. I'm in this other one. Some people, I'm just too old. Is 75 too old to begin? No. Abraham was 75 years old when he was called out of Haran. Genesis 12 and verse 4. I began martial arts at age 75. Well, just, dust off your boots and put your cowboy hat on straight. I mean, we've got things to accomplish. Moses was 80 when he went down to confront Pharaoh in Egypt. Exodus 7 verse. Oh no, see, everybody ought to retire at, maybe age 50, 65 at the latest. You may just be getting your engines up to full speed. See, that's different than the way America thinks. Oh man, those engines are starting to roll and the mufflers are. So as you think about that, how about Anna in the temple? Luke 2:37, when Jesus was presented there, she was 84 years old and ministering there day and night. You go, I think you just stop at 50. He said, oh no, you don't have to stop at 50. You may just be starting at 50. Caleb, the Joshua and Caleb heroes. In Joshua chapter 14, verses 10 through 11, Caleb says he was 45 when he was called to go on the reconnaissance mission for God into Palestine. And at 85, he says, as my strength was then, so it is now for going out and coming in and going to war. He said, anything you need, I'm ready. 85. Man, my hair can prickle as I think about that. Because we're used to thinking that's the time you shut down, lay over, and die. God said, oh no. As long as you got life, you're breathing, you have influence. And think about that statement that Caleb made 3,000 years later impacts me. And what the reality is, we all have that. And as we think about it, oftentimes they didn't just start then, but they were maybe called then. They were used to being used and being active in the service of God. They didn't retire. How about you and I? So I'm retiring as a Christian when I'm X age. I will hopefully stop being active when I'm called from this life. And until then, we've got stuff to do. Abraham was the father of the faithful. Moses was the lawgiver, and he didn't think he was a very good speaker. Anna, a prophetess. Caleb, a warrior. Think about this. Your golden years may be the most fruitful yet. Don't power down the engines. Power them up. The power of influence. Well, what about if you go to the other end? Maybe can you be too young or too little to have influence? Jesus was a baby. In Isaiah chapter 9 and verse 6, unto us a son is born, a child is given. Right away as a baby, Jesus had an impact. Why? Here were the shepherds in the field, told by the angel there's a baby. They go to see the child, and then they go and tell others. Guess what? The shepherds had an influence. The baby had an influence. As you think about that, one of the neat stories is Samuel. Here's the judge that had anointed Saul, anointed David. He was an incredible figure. It is said when he was 12, we really don't know how old he was. Josephus in Antiquities, book 5, chapter 10, verse 4 says he was 12. He could have been 8, somewhere in these young years, when God has him to deliver a message to Eli. Do you have to wait till you're 42 years to get started? He started when he was 12. Young people, we had the opportunity of moving Jeff and Kim Dillinger. It's just a handful. You have too many people, you trip over each other. But I was really impressed. Of course, Jeff and Kim are there. It's their stuff, and they're moving. Okay, this box goes here, and that one goes there. Joel and Carly were involved. Carly, daughter, Joel, son-in-law. And see if I get this straight. I understand they went to Hawaii, and Carly got her mom a T-shirt that says, "My son-in-law is my favorite son." And Kim said, "I didn't buy the shirt." There's humor with that. But not only Carly's involved in making things happen. Here's Joel's part. There's this incredibly heavy tool chest. I mean, it's like 7 feet long. I figured it weighed half a ton. And Jeff is trying, we got to get it up a ramp. And we're trying to make sure, man, you don't want it to get loose and run over everybody. And so you got guys from behind pushing and had some straps in the front. And so I'm going to be at the top end. My thing, I'm just stabilizing, steering. I'll help drag it up. That isn't what happened. Paul, get out of the way. Joel, and the guy, boom! I mean, and I was impressed by that. But not just by that. The kids were out there. They're carrying carpets. I'm one end of some kind of cabinet or something. The 12-year-olds got the other end. I want you to know your participation impacted me. But see, we don't think about it being that way. It's always that way. And Samuel was maybe 8, 10, or 12, somewhere in there. Mary, not when she had Jesus, but when Gabriel spoke to her. Now, we don't know her age either. But it's estimated because a lot of times girls would be engaged by ages 12 to 16. I know parents now say, daughters, don't think about it, I'll choke you. So, because our whole culture is different. So it is thought, perhaps, and we don't know for sure, that Mary might have been 14 years old when the angel Gabriel spoke to her and said, here's the plan. And she said, be it done to your servant, according to as you've said. 14-year-olds can make life-changing decisions. I mean, it's chilling, it's thrilling, because it's really real. And because of the decision she made, Jesus was born. We've all been changed because of the decision a 14-year-old made 2,000 years ago. Are you too young? Joseph, we know, was 17. Joseph in the Old Testament, Genesis 37 and verse 2. Now, he was being used to save his family. Now, he didn't know that's what was happening. He thinks he's just being martyred by his brother, sold into slavery, and just get the kid out of here. But because he was the kind of person he was, he made amazing choices. And he ended up in a position of authority and command and saved his entire family. It started at 17. We all have the power of influence. We think, yeah, well, it's not too young, but I'm just not very tall. It's been years ago, I was in West Campus preaching, and I've forgotten who it was, maybe a visitor. And so I'd gotten done preaching, and like I do, often at the end, I'll maybe stand in the back and say hello to people. And the lady standing next to me, she said, you're not as tall as you look to be on the pulpit. I said, no, man, not one of the shortest guys around. It just is. Well, how about Zacchaeus in Luke chapter 19 and verses 3 through 8? It says that he was a publican, a tax collector, and small of stature. So he's going to climb a tree. He wants to see Jesus. That impresses Jesus. He said, come down because I'm going to eat at your house today. He was rich. He could afford it. But people started grumbling, oh, you're eating with a tax collector. I mean, I bet nobody here, I've met a tax collector. He's been in my house. He wanted to check all my records, and it was within tolerance. I did not invite him for lunch. We don't generally do those things. I invite you, say, give me an okay and goodbye. And Jesus said, I'm going to eat at your house, and people are grumbling because he's a tax collector. And he said, I'll give back fourfold if I've wronged anybody. What an amazing heart. And so how tall you are, how good looking or challenged or young or old, doesn't matter. You have an influence. You have an influence. And it always goes way beyond what we would anticipate. There's an African proverb. It is said, if you think you're too small to make a difference, try spending the night in a closed room with a mosquito. Once you take that to heart, I mean, you have an impact. We have an impact on each other. You impact me. Well, what if somebody said, yeah, but Paul, that's true for them, but see, my circumstances are different. See, I came from a really bad background, and, I don't know if I could have an influence. Well, how about Mary Magdalene? I mentioned her. She's one of my absolute, hands down, favorite New Testament characters. And Luke chapter 8, verse 2 and 3 says she had 7 demons cast out of her. Now, you talk about a person from a challenged background. I mean, not a demon, not 2, 7. This gal had problems. But she was among the women that followed Jesus from Galilee. She contributed, as the others did, to Jesus and the apostles out of her private means. She was at the cross. She was at the tomb. And she was the first one to whom Jesus appeared. Did Mary Magdalene make a difference? She makes a difference to me. I said, wow. Somebody from a challenged background could make it to then I can too. You have that impact on each other. The Samaritan woman in John chapter 4 is the woman at the well. And he says, go call your husband. She said, I have no husband. He said, you've well said. You've had 5 husbands, and the one you now have is not your husband. I mean, she had marital challenges. But in John 4, verse 18, and then verse 29, she goes into the town and says, come see one who told me all things that I had done. She has a challenged background. She made an excellent evangelist. Said, I've just talked to somebody that you need to talk to. How about David? He lied. He was immoral. He was a murderer. He set it up. And yet he had that repentant attitude in Psalm chapter 51. And although he suffered these incredible consequences of his action the rest of his life, in Acts 13:36, a scripture I've quoted repeatedly, so impressive. David, after he had served the purpose of God in his own generation, fell asleep. He brought the nation together. He united it. He defeated the enemies. He repented with anguish when he was wrong. And he was part of the lineage of Christ. Wow. See, sometimes we feel like we're beat up or we've made so many mistakes, we give up. David's life says, don't do that. You may be just starting. Paul himself saw himself, I am the foremost of sinners in 1 Timothy 1:15. Why? Well, he cast his vote against Christians being killed before he learned that's what I need to be. All of us have things in our past that we regret. That's true across the board. Don't stop there, and don't let it stop you now. Think about Rahab in Matthew 1 and in verse 5. She was the one that guarded, protected Joshua and Caleb and repented of her life. She's noted in Matthew 1:5 in the lineage of Christ, and in Hebrews 11:31 is cited as among those that are in the Heroes Hall of Faith. Wow. You got a bad background. Probably theirs is worse than ours. Yeah, but what if you have or had a challenged marriage? Timothy's mom, a Jewish, married to a Greek. We find out in Acts 16 and verse 1. Mom and grandmother were believers before the boy. 2 Timothy 1:5. And from childhood, Paul said, 2 Timothy 3:16, you have known the scriptures. How do you know that? Mom and grandma. Moms and grandmas, you got an opportunity. Here's your kids and grandkids and somebody else's kids and somebody else's grandkids. You can have that impact. You make a difference in their lives. And because of that, Timothy's reputation, and again, it's guesstimated, and I'll tell you why they come to this. Maybe he was 16 when Paul chose him to go on that second missionary journey. Why they say that is toward the end of Paul's life, he tells Timothy that you've got a job to do, and don't let anyone look down on your youthfulness. In their culture, you're young till you're 40. After that, you're just not in your 20s anymore. And he traveled with Paul perhaps 20 years. And so it is by that thought, Timothy was not yet 40. So, 37, 38, 36, somewhere in that area. Here is somebody, if 16 is approximately right, we find out from Acts 16 and verse 3 that he had a reputation known not only in his hometown Lystra, but 20 miles away in Iconium. Young people, you make a difference, and we're so thankful for you. Keep on doing those good things because you have the power of influence. Ruth was a Moabite woman married to a Jew and then widowed after 10 years, Ruth 1, 4, and 5. but she demonstrated tremendous dedication. When Naomi, the mother-in-law, her own husband died, Naomi's did, and both sons died, and they tried to make a go of it in Moab, and she was just crushed, and so she's going back to her people in Israel. And that's where Ruth says, where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. And where you die, I will die. Your God will be my God. She's made a change. I've made a decision. I'm going to be not only on the right spiritual track, but the one that you have demonstrated to me. Naomi's influence on Ruth. And God, may God do to me and more, if anything but death separate you and I. Wow. Well, such a tremendous attitude, was hardworking and humble and generous and loving, and a great reputation, because Boaz, a wealthy farmer, sees this really beautiful young lady and asks, what about her? And the people talking about her said, this is Ruth, the daughter-in-law of Naomi, and it has been told how good she was to her own husband, and now to her mother-in-law. You have a reputation. You make an impact. And this person tells that person, who tells this other person, and her situation as well became the ancestor of King David, and so of Christ himself. Matthew chapter 1 and verse 5, and also in verse 16. It doesn't matter how old you are. It doesn't matter how young you are. It doesn't matter how short or tall you are. What matters is, are you willing to have a heart to serve God? What about this? Just a couple more and we'll wrap up. And the power of influence. Not only do people have challenges from bad backgrounds, but make spectacular changes. Well, what if you didn't come from a situation of all that? What if you just, or now happen to be a positive spiritual person? Well, that's a blessing. Barnabas seems to have been of that disposition. We come across him in Acts chapter 4 and verse 36. Here's a Christian who, when there's needs, he sells a piece of property and gives the money away. You go, whoa, that catches your attention. Caught other people's attention too, that didn't necessarily have a good attitude, Ananias and Sapphira, but that's their problem. He had this tremendous giving, loving, caring disposition. And so the apostles nicknamed him, man, if Mr. and Mrs. Encouragement ever had a baby, you would be it. And you are the son of encouragement. And so you're familiar, when Paul went on his first missionary journey, Mark was a dropout, a disappointment, a loser, and he went back home to cry on mama's shoulder. It's hard out there, or whatever it was. Come in the second missionary journey, cousin Barnabas thinks Mark's learned his lesson. Let's take him. And Paul said, I'm making up my own dialogue here, over my dead body, we are not taking this kid again. And Barnabas said, I think he's learned his lesson. Paul said he'd not begun to learn the lesson. And Barnabas said he's coming. And Paul said, I'm of course just ad-libbing the dialogue. He is coming. So this big kerfuffle. And Barnabas says, I'm taking him. Paul says, good, because he's not coming with me. And Barnabas took him. And Mark showed his stuff and became what he could and should have been, so that we find that Mark proved himself trustworthy. And at the end of Paul's life, Paul tells Timothy, pick up Mark and bring him, for he's useful to me for ministry. So just because you made a mistake or mistakes, that's water under the bridge. Move forward. How encouraging Barnabas was. And he had an impact on Mark. And because he did, Mark had a change of heart. And he was encouraged and stood up. And he has an impact on me. How about Aquila and Priscilla? They were great Bible teachers. Here's Apollos, a mighty preacher, but didn't have all it doctrinally, the I's dotted. And they took him aside privately and taught him the way of God more perfectly. They're mentioned in Romans 16, how they were courageous. Paul says they risked their necks. They risked their lives for my sake. And the Gentiles churches gave thanks, that is, for saving Paul, because Aquila and Priscilla did that. And they had a congregation meeting in their own house. So it doesn't matter your background, it doesn't matter your age, it doesn't matter what your marital heartaches or victories were. It matters if you love the Lord. Because, Christians, you are the light. We've looked at this idea of the power of influence. And we don't begin to see it. In fact, I took a Christian aside this morning. I said, how do you see that your influence impacts the congregation? They said, well, I see it this way. I said, yeah, let me tell you the ways that I see it. I said, what do you do? Well, attend regularly. Hebrews 10:25. Do not forsake the assembling of ourselves together. You just being here is an encouragement. You're an encouragement to me. It honors God. You bless one another. And be involved. No excuses. That Luke 14:18 and following here is, one guy's, well, I got married. I just bought some animals. I got to check them out, make sure, they're still under warranty. I got all kind of reasons why not to do. One of the things I mentioned years ago that my mother said to me, it's not strictly true, but kind of. She wanted me to do something, I don't know, take out the garbage. She said, Mom, I can't. And she'd tell me, can't means I don't want to. I didn't like that. But that is a truism, right? If you want to do something bad enough, what will you do? If you want it bad enough, most of the times you do it. If your children are in the hospital, where are you going to be? Yeah, but they wanted you to be at work. Well, you're supposed to this and that. Hey, look, all of that is good. I'm going to be where the one I love is. So think about it, because there's always going to be too much and other things. You decide, I'm going to be here because you are the light of the world. And let your light shine today. In Daniel chapter 12 and down in verse 3, those that have insight will shine like the stars forever and ever. You have an impact on the next generation. You have an impact on your friends, they on their friends, they on their kids, and on their kids. Think about this where we close. Tabitha, named Dorcas, in Acts chapter 9. We don't know, really, whether she was married or not. A husband isn't mentioned. It is supposed that either she wasn't married or widowed, because she dies and there's no husband or children mentioned. But the widows for whom she made clothing were weeping and surrounding her. You make a difference in life, and you start that by coming to Jesus. If you've not been baptized into Christ and your attitude, I love the Lord, I'm willing to repent of my sins, I want to confess his name, I will be buried in the waters of baptism and have my sins washed away. You've got an opportunity this morning.